Hi, I'm Jon Underwood from Death Cafe. I started off this thing called Death Cafe, and Death Cafe is all about talking about death. And I gave up a well-paid, very boring but secure job in Tower Hamlets Council to pursue my dream of talking about death. And I remember distinctly, just shortly after doing that, talking to my father-in-law and saying, this is Death Cafe. This is what we're going to do, and we're going to change the world. It's going to be brilliant. It's going to be amazing. And he said to me, John, the problem with that, no one wants to talk about death. And I thought, shit, that is a massive problem. But the good news is Brian, my stepfather, was wrong. People do want to talk about death. And since we did our first Death Cafe, which was 2 years ago tomorrow, in the basement of my house with my mum facilitating and sort of arranging it all. Death Cafe spread throughout the world. We've gone to America, Australia, New Zealand. We've had between 200 and 300. We've had several thousand people talking about death. We've been on Radio 4. My mum's been on Woman's Hour, which she was extremely pleased about. We've been on the front page of the New York Times, which was just unreal. And we've got loads and loads of people talking about death. And I'm extremely proud of it. And you may be wondering what a death cafe is. It's very simple. We just come together in a safe space and talk about death. And our objective is to help people make the most of their finite lives. And it's not really my idea. It comes from a guy in Switzerland called Bernard Cretas, who created something called the Café Mortel. And we've got a number of principles which are kind of a container to keep the good stuff in. So we never do death cafes for cash. We never lead people towards any product conclusion or course of action. We're respectful of all different people's views and beliefs. And there's always cake. Now, the cake is actually very important because any caterer will tell you that people eat far more at a funeral than at a wedding. And people have this strange belief, if I actually start talking about death, it's like an attractor. It's like death's going to come into the room, or, death's going to death me or something like that. And the act of eating offers some sort of protection against that kind of fear, and sort of helps us talk. But the thing about death cafes, the thing why I do this, and the thing why I'd recommend all of you to go along to one if you feel like it, is because when you talk about death, people just say the wildest, craziest, most amazing, most beautiful things. Seems that even us English people, known for being stiff and, slightly, like that, it all falls away. And it doesn't seem to matter because death has a magical sort of quality about it, which just helps people live. And Bernard Cretas said it very beautifully, the Swiss sociologist who came up with this, really. He said, for a short time, and thanks to death, people are born in authenticity. And I could tell you stories of what people have said that would make your hair curl if you didn't have curly hair already or something like that. But I can't, because what happens in a death cafe, what's said there, stays in a death cafe. But believe me, people just tell it like it is. They tell their truth. They say things that you feel have sort of fermented inside them for years and years and years. And in the Death Cafe, we create the space where they can finally let them out. And it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And Death Cafe's kind of got people talking about death in a way that a number of other interventions sort of haven't. I mean, it's got a rich history. We're standing on the shoulders of giants like Bernard Cretas and like the Natural Death Center, who organized death salons doing pretty much this same kind of thing over 20 years ago. There are a lot of people who tell you that they know how to deal with death. they can give you a tick list and you'll do this and you'll do that. There's a lot of people who kind of present that they know. I think that's kind of worrying, and I think it's kind of reductive as well, because I don't think that there's a way that people should deal with death. I don't know how you should deal with death. One thing that, I mean, social media, as James really put across, has sort of changed the context, has changed the way we deal with this. The fundamental's the same. You're all gonna die, you know, and I can't tell you how to live your life in the context of that. That's a question for you. And I think Death Cafe and other interventions that help people to talk about death have this magical quality of letting you ask that question, you know, what's important to me? Someday, you know, I'm gonna die. Someday, it's gonna happen to all of us. And I want people to be able to look back on their time and say, you know, yes, you know, I'm proud of that. That was my truth. That was my life. I looked at my life and I came up with a way that I wanted to live. And I think in our society, we push death to the sidelines, you know. We've got a very strange relationship with death. On one hand, we push it out of sight. Real death is outsourced. It's the domain of those people who are professionals, be they in the medical profession or the funeral profession or the religious profession. You know, we kind of put real death, give it over to them. But on the other hand, we kind of compulsively consume a really weird kind of death. Like, obviously in our news media, there's a thing about if it bleeds, it leads. Through music, through games, GTA 5 example, you'll see a lot of strange death in that. Through films, so we've got a kind of, we consume a sort of really alien and terrifying death, but we push death to the sidelines. So there's something strange going on there. And call me a conspiracy theorist, but I think that some people may have an interest in keeping death terrifying. And I think that if death, real death, is pushed to the sidelines, I think there is a gulf of meaning, because I think meaning is defined in relation to death, because once one accepts that one is gonna die, one is presented with this question, you know, I'm alive now. What do I want to do with that time? What's meaningful for me? And so if we push death to the sidelines, we don't ask that question, we create a vacuum of meaning, and then we people are able to present something that is meaningful to us. So what becomes meaningful? It's youth is meaningful. We must achieve youth. Or power is meaningful. Or wealth is meaningful. And we're sold a lot of dreams. So I think that death denial is closely related to consumer capitalism. And I believe that death denial is the energy that drives the motor of consumer capitalism. And I think probably at this point you're thinking I'm completely mad, but just to give a little bit of credibility to my point, there was a study that was conducted in an American university a couple of years ago, and they invited, you know, the subjects into the laboratory, and they put them in a role-playing situation where they were the CEO of an energy company. And they said, okay, you've got to allocate your resources going forward. And half of the cohort they gave what they called a death prompt to, which was a newspaper story about someone who died in a plane crash, and the other cohort they gave a neutral news story to. And then they looked at the way that those people allocated those resources of the energy company going forward. And consistently, those people who'd been given the death prompt allocated more to the future than the present, and more to other people than themselves. And that led people to believe that, led the scientists to believe that thinking about death activates some sort of what they called a legacy motive, but it changes one's value system in a way that attacks the basic premise of capitalism, which is achieving more for oneself. And you know, if you look at humankind as a single entity, you know, we're pretty sick. We're addicted to a model of consumer capitalism which is completely unsustainable. None of our politicians are offering anything in terms of a realistic, even acknowledgement of that, never mind an alternative to it. And I think that thinking about death has a major role to play in us addressing some of the fundamental challenges that face the Earth. So you've seen Damien Hirst shark, you know, which is the, I forget exactly what it's called, but it's the inability to think about death in the mind of the living or something. But I think, you know, humankind's on a bit of a death trip at the moment, and we've got some quite fundamental choices to make. And I think, and this is why I do this work, that thinking about death and assimilating our understanding of death has a major role to play in addressing some of those fundamental challenges. And I think we've come to a pivotal moment now in relation to that. And I think the spread of Death Cafe is one indication that people are ready to adopt a new approach to death and dying. And the other hopeful thing that I would say is that the baby boomer generation, you know, the most important generation that's ever lived on this planet, the generation that's had the improving standard of living throughout their entire lives, 2015, they sort of, more and more of them come to the top of the elevator. And you know, a lot of the gains that were made in the 60s around sex and equality, we kind of have to a large degree. So we've moved, but not with death. And I think now is the time that things are really going to shift. Okay, that's me.